All right, welcome. I'm Deborah Satz, and on behalf of the Center for Ethics in Society, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's discussion, Beyond Terror, America After Bin Laden. Tonight's event is part of a series that aims to stimulate research, teaching, and engagement on one of the most pressing issues of our time, war. Although maybe Steven Pinker is correct when he writes that we're less violent than ever, at least less violent than our ancestors of 500 years ago were, the fact is that we live at a time when the fires of war and conflict are burning around the world. Our own country has been involved in many of these conflicts, and these conflicts give rise to many questions, some of which are empirical and social scientific, and some of which are ethical. And the series that we've been running focuses on the ethical questions. How should we as citizens respond to wars and conflicts that are waged in our name? When, if ever, are we justified in going to war? How should wars be fought? What tactics are permissible to use in war? Many campus groups and organizations have collaborated in putting on this series. These include not only the Ethics Center, but the Center for International Security and Cooperation, the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, the Program in Creative Writing, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Drama Department. So this is a pretty broad-based and unusual collaboration. Joan Berry has been the center point person for the series, but many hands have made this, and I want to extend my thanks to all co-conspirators. This is the second year of the series, and for those of you who've been attending, I think will know that it has been a very stimulating set of events, and that we have succeeded in some of our aims. One of the things I'm the most excited about is that a course is being launched at Stanford in Ethics and War this spring, with plans to continue to make courses on these topics part of the curriculum. This is a series, and I encourage anybody who's interested to attend as many of our events as possible. Now I want to turn to tonight. So when we originally thought about this conversation, we were aiming for September. We didn't quite make that, but we were thinking about the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Roughly 10 years after the horrifying attacks on the World Trade Center, even as the United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq, we can be sure of one thing: the story that began that day, and actually began before, isn't over. And we thought who better to lead us off on reflecting on this unfolding tale than Lawrence Wright, who wrote what must be viewed as the definitive work on the antecedents of 9/11. His book, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, was published to widespread acclaim, spending 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and being translated into 25 languages. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the audience have read the book? So, right, a good percentage. If you haven't read it, I urge you to read it. It's an amazing, amazing read, and extremely eye-opening. It was nominated for the National Book Award. It's won a long list of accolades and other awards, including the Los Angeles Times Award for History, the Anthony Lucas Book Prize, the New York Public Library Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. The NYU School of Journalism recently honored the book as one of the 10 best works of journalism in the previous decade. In this book, Wright tries to understand why the protagonists believe what they believed, what motivated them to act, and the shape of the battleground over belief. To this end, he conducted an amazing amount of detective work, interviews, and pounding the pavement. In one review of the book I read, the reviewer wrote, quote, "This guy's work ethics makes every other scribbler look like a punk." The book is full of haunting details including the struggle between the CIA and the FBI in the months leading up to attacks, Bin Laden's long trail of speeches, and even his poetry. Lawrence Wright is an author, screenwriter, playwright, and staff writer for the New Yorker magazine, and he's the author of many other books, although perhaps we'll explore tonight, there's some similar themes covered in some of his other books. His books include In the New World, Growing Up with America, 1960 to 1984, Saints and Sinners, Remembering Satan, Twins, Genes, Environment, and the Mystery of Identity, and God's Favorite. He also serves as the keyboard player in the Austin-based blues band, Hoodoo. Who knew? After making some initial remarks, Lawrence Wright will be joined in conversation by two of Stanford's own, Tobias Wolff and Martha Crenshaw. Tobias Wolff is professor of English at Stanford and the author of many novels and short story collections, which have also won many awards. These include The Barracks Thief and Old School, the memoirs This Boy's Life and In Pharaoh's Army, and the short story collection In the Gardens of the North American Martyrs, as well as The Night in Question. His work has won prizes from the PEN Malamud Award, the RIA Award for Excellence in the Short Story, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the PEN Faulkner Award. His work appears regularly in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's, and other magazines and literary journals. He's also, as many of you may know, a Vietnam War veteran, and he's been a driving force behind this series. Lawrence Wright will also be joined by Martha Crenshaw, who's a senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and a professor of political science by courtesy at Stanford. She taught from 1974 to 2007 as a professor of political science at Wesleyan University. She's written extensively on the issue of political terrorism. It says on her website that her first article, The Concept of Revolutionary Terrorism, was published in 1972. So this is somebody who has been devoting many years and much thought to an issue that's only recently erupted on the front page and in our face, so to speak. Her recent work includes Trajectories of Terrorism, Attack Patterns of Foreign Groups That Have Targeted the United States, 1970 to 2004, the Obama Administration and Counterterrorism, and Will Threats Deter Nuclear Terrorism? In 2011, Routledge published Explaining Terrorism, which is a collection of her previously published work. So we're very honored to have these three guests, and we'll begin with some remarks by Lawrence Wright. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you all for coming and for having me here. I'm so honored by the invitation and flattered by the number of hands that went up when she asked how many had read the book. I'm really happy about that. I have a few minutes to talk before we get into our conversation, and I thought I'd begin by giving a little bit of a survey of what's happening right now in the Arab world. In some part because of the events of 9/11 and our response to it. But I'm going to go back a little bit because I started my career as a young reporter covering the civil rights movement. Probably the most important social movement in our country's history, and defines so much of the country that we are today. And there's a plaque in Montgomery to the martyrs of the civil rights movement. And on that plaque, there are 40 names. And some of those names you probably know: Martin Luther King, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers. Those are the people that have highways or schools named after them, but most of them you don't know. They're people that died along the way, and there's this great social movement that was so transformative of our country. And I bring that up because in the Arab world today, there's this immense nonviolent revolution going on. When I was in Egypt last, it was just before the presidential election, and in the cascade of events that happened subsequently, I think that presidential election was very informative to a lot of people, especially in Egypt. And I was talking in my old school, I went to the American University of Cairo. I taught there for 2 years. And I was speaking to a group of students. And when I taught there in 69 to 71, Egypt was about on the same level. It was a developing country like South Korea, India, China, Singapore, Brazil. All of those countries ignited, but Egypt and most of the Arab world stayed behind. And this young woman in a hijab stood up and asked, "What happened to us?" And I thought to myself, how do I answer that question? And it occurred to me, I reflected on my father, who was a kid in the Dust Bowl in Kansas, and then went off to World War II, and we call that the greatest generation. But it was a generation that changed America at that time. And now there are generations like that in India and in Korea and other places like that, where they're transforming their countries. And I said, I think it takes a generation, a generational commitment. And it didn't occur to me when I was talking to these kids that they were the generation. Because 2 years later, they were out in Tahrir Square, which was just outside the door, making that change. In the 17 days of the Egyptian Revolution, 840 people died. 800 more than died in our Civil Rights Revolution. If you look at Syria, more than 6,000 people to this point have died. And they're not facing fire hoses and police batons. They're walking into the face of helicopter gunships and tanks. The sacrifice that's going on is unbelievable, and I think unappreciated. There's reporters, when you're in a foreign country, you often hire what's called a fixer, and I happen to have one of my fixers here tonight who was my fixer in Bolivia. And she helped me pick out this jacket, which was made for me by the tailor to the president of Bolivia. I'm very fond of this jacket. When I was in Syria, my fixer was a hot-headed, very attractive young woman that I'll call Noor. And I'm going to tell you a story because I'm a storyteller, but this, I think, will help you understand the situation in Syria in particular, but to some extent, it speaks about the situation of people who've lived in tyrannical countries all over the world. I decided when I was asked by the New Yorker to write an article about Syria, I thought, I would love to do that. I'd never been, but how do you write about Syria? It was such an intriguing country because it's set in one of the most garrulous regions in the whole world. If you've spent any time in the Middle East, in Israel and Egypt, it's paradise for reporters. Syria is so quiet. You don't hear anything. You just never heard anything from Syria. So how do you crack into the psychology of that country? It occurred to me that so much of the world knows America through its movies. So I thought I would go to Syria and I'd look look at their movies and I would talk to their filmmakers, and in a way I could understand something about the psychology of the Syrian culture. And it was a fascinating thing to do because there actually are some very distinguished Syrian filmmakers. They all work for the government. But they're not propagandists. In fact, many of their films are shown at international festivals all over the world, but not in Syria. Although they like to make films in Syria, they're opposed to showing them because it's dangerous. People gather together. In the 1980s, there were 120 cinemas in Syria. Now there are 6. Yet there are these filmmakers. And so I talked to them and I watched their movies, and certainly they did have something in common in those movies that was very surprising to me. Physical abuse. In practically every movie, there was an incredibly abusive representation. And in talking to these directors and actors and so on, in every case, they had been beaten, and by their parents or their teachers or something like that. And I thought, this is really unexpected. One day, I went with Noor, my fixer, to a cafe called the Wright Cafe. It's kind of an artist and intellectual hangout in Damascus. And we were interviewing an actor who's a very popular Syrian actor named Faris Helou. He reminded me a little bit of Jack Lemmon. He had a kind of dark comedy about him, and he's just incredibly popular in Syria. He's on a lot of television shows and so on. And he said, because I'm loved, I'm protected. While we were talking, this fan appeared. And he was a big, broad-shouldered young man, and he came over to Faris and he said, "I love you. I just think you're the greatest, And he sat down for a moment and he said, "I just want to exchange mobile telephone numbers with you." And to my surprise, Faris gave him his number, and then, he disappeared. And then he came back again. And I said, "Well, what's your name?" And he said, "Well, my friends call me Stalin because I like to kill." And then he asked Faris, he said, "I have another phone. And actually it's connected, I'm very close to the government. And I can help you. And so, I want your phone number for this, And it began to get really creepy and really scary. And at one point, he put his hand on, he asked Faris if he was a member of the Ba'ath Party, and he said no. And he said, "You cannot not be a member. I will pay your dues for you." And so he came back a 4th time with another phone. Weirdness. It was, but he said, he put his hand around Faris's shoulder and he says, "I feel like beating someone. May I beat you?" And I said, "Let's get out of here." But all this time, Noor was mouthing off to this guy. And I was afraid for her. And finally, I found out her story. Both of her parents had been political prisoners. Her mother for 2 years, her father for 13 years. And he was locked up in a prison that was famous for torture and isolation. Noor grew up idolizing his memory, but she didn't really know him. And when he finally came out of prison, she was this attractive young woman, very headstrong. And she wasn't used to his authority. And so he beat her up. And then he locked her in her room for 2 years. Essentially, she was placed in isolation. While she was in that room, she had her television, her radio, her music, and she taught herself English. And she came out of the room 2 years later fluent in a language she had never spoken, and made a living supporting her parents by working for people like me. And the object of this story is to let you know in the psychology that is so prevalent in Syria and in other places because of years and years of tyrannical rule. It's not just a matter of getting rid of the dictator. It's a matter of getting rid of the oppression that has filtered down through the entire society. I'm not going to hit on every country in the Middle East. I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. Nothing's going to happen in Saudi Arabia, so get over it. It's going to stay like it is for a long, long time, although it's going to go through a terrible crisis because the king is really old and so is his successor, and they're all ill. And there's going to be a vast crisis coming probably in the next year or two. But I don't think it's going to change anything. One of the women that I spoke to in Saudi Arabia, who was at that point still hoping to be able to drive a car, said to me, it's reform without change. So that's probably the scenario that we'll see in Saudi Arabia for some time to come. Libya and Iraq, I put them together because in some ways they're similar countries. They're artificial creations that could easily splinter apart. They've been living under a thugocracy. Iraq now trying to find a way to be a democracy, and it's unclear whether, after all our blood and all the expenditure that we've put out into that country, that it's going to succeed at all. And Libya, it's too early to tell. One last country I'm going to mention, and that's Israel. These changes are foreboding in a way for Israel. I think I cannot get over how there's an axis of complacency and anxiety that you find in Israel that is really unsettling for an outsider. It's especially unsettling to me, who spent a lot of time in the Arab world and in Israel, to feel like I have a greater investment in peace than they do. I was performing a one-man show in Tel Aviv last spring. It was about Gilad Shalit, who was a young Israeli soldier who was abducted by Hamas in 2006 and was recently exchanged finally for 1,024, I think, Palestinian prisoners. And the question that the play was exploring is, how does one life get to be worth 1,000 lives? And what does that say, this equation about the value of human life in that region? But after the show each night, we'd have a talk back. And there would be settlers and Zionist theorists and grieving families, and there were a whole cross-section of Israel night after night. It was a great experience for me. But the very first night, the interlocutor said, well, why do you, an American, take an interest in this, in these problems? And I said, well, you call me an outsider, but there's a hole in Manhattan that might not have been there if it weren't for the tensions arising from this region. We've just spent $1 trillion in Iraq, put 100,000 troops in there, and we've got 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, and we're about to spend another $1 trillion there at a time when that seems like real money, in part because of the inflammation that arises from the dispute that goes on in this region. I'm 64 years old. I'm the same age as Israel. I was born in the segregated South. We all were, as a matter of fact. Now we have a black man who's president of the United States. We have seen in our lifetime the Soviet Union dissolve. We've seen apartheid in South Africa go away. Now we're watching the tyrants in the Arab world being rolled aside one by one. But this conflict goes on and on as if it's blessed to be eternal. It's not. All political conflicts can be resolved politically. This problem has gone on because there's no political will on either side to come to the compromises that are needed to be made in order to resolve it. But it's headed towards, I think, a very perilous conclusion. And I sometimes think that the people in the region don't realize exactly how dangerous it is. It's going to get more so. And so I think that, I'm going to wrap up now. I think Al-Qaeda has come to a period of, where its influence is diminishing. But many of the factors that caused it to arise are still present and will continue to be a factor in our world. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys at this point.
Well, if I could just pick up on this last comment, I'm curious, what are those factors then? How would you describe those things that made Al-Qaeda possible and that continue to irritate these peoples with each other?
There's no one thing, Toby. It's like, my analogy is despair in a generalized way. And there are many contributors: unemployment, lack of education, gender apartheid, also the sense of being marginalized in the world, the absence of progress that, this is such a young world in the Middle East, and they have so little to look forward to in terms of the economy. I mean, if you take all of the 22 countries that make up the Arab world, and take oil out of those 22 economies, their gross national product, there are 300 million Arabs, about the same number as there are Americans. You take oil out of them, the industrial output is less than that of the country of Finland. 5 million people in Finland produce for export as much as the entire Arab world. And then if you put oil back into those economies, those 22 countries, those 300 million people, their gross national product is less than the state of California. So, we're talking about economies that offer these young people very few alternatives and very little to look forward to. And it's striking how many, you'll get in a cab, and the guy's driving a cab is a PhD, but he's fortunate to have a job.
Well, if I could draw you out a little bit more about the consequences of the Arab Spring for Islamism, and particularly what happens in Egypt, because I think that's an important key. If things don't go well with the Arab Spring economically or politically, will this lead to a revival of the same sorts of forces that led to Al-Qaeda? Perhaps not Al-Qaeda as we knew it then, but another form of Islamism. I noted, for example, that the Egyptian group, Al-Jamaa al-Islamiyya, has been asked to join forces with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And I wonder how you would think about those developments.
Jamaa al-Islamiyya was the most violent of all the groups, and they killed more than 1,000 Egyptians in the 1990s. And then most of them got rounded up and put in prison. And they had a chance to talk over what they had accomplished, which was nothing. They had done nothing but kill people. And they had made no changes except make the country more repressive than it already was, and they realized that. And I talked to one of the leaders 4 years ago, and he's an old grandfather who has dyed his hair blonde. And I don't know why I'm so struck by that, but he had this long, blonde, wavy hair. And but he was very moving on the fact that they had been so fruitless in their efforts. And while we were talking, he had the television on, and Dream TV, which is one of the stations that broadcasts old Egyptian movies, black and white movies. And it's funny because those old movies are constantly running in Egypt as a commentary. They're seen as political because there was an Egypt in the past that was open and tolerant. When I was teaching in 1969 to 71, you almost never saw a woman covered. Even at, not just at the American University, you could go to Cairo University. You can go look at the class list, and there are women and men standing there just like this. You know, there was very, very, you know, the whole Islamist trend was very moderated, just not that present. But decades of tyranny, I think, created this impression that the only thing that can resist it is Islam. That's the only force strong enough. And so many people turned to Islam because all the other parties were vitiated and had no guts, or else were, you know, rounded up and put in prison. That's where the core of the Muslim Brothers comes from. And they've got the credibility that they've been in prison, and yet for years and years, their only political agenda was cover the women. And they've succeeded in that. You know, the women are covered now. But it doesn't get you a job. It doesn't, you know, when I think about the political situation in Egypt, I think about crossing the street. It's one of the most dangerous things imaginable. And I had a servant, a froggy, as they were called. When I was a young man, when I went to teach at Egypt, they assign you a servant to cook for you and clean for you. And I love this man, Shafi. He was so great, and we had such a wonderful relationship. He lost 2 children crossing the street at different times. There are no traffic lights. When I would cross the street, I would try to find a woman with children and get in the lee of them, you know. So I figured that the drivers would take a little pity on them, and I would just be kind of dragging along behind them. But a government that cares so little for its people that it didn't care enough to put pedestrian crossings or traffic lights to make it safe for them, that is the level of callousness that now, you know, the Muslim Brothers are going to inherit a broken country, a broken economy, a country that's very poorly equipped to deal with the modern world. And on top of that, their own ideology is at war with a lot of the kinds of changes that would make Egypt fit better into the world. So they're going to have a real challenge. And of course, we're all going to we're going to learn whether they're going to be serious about democracy. They claim to be. Even Gamma Islamiyah claims to be, you know, that they have given their pledge that they're going to abide by the system. I think Egypt's in for a very, very rough run of it. It's going to take decades to make it succeed, but it can succeed. It's got, for one thing, it's not going to fall apart. It has a sense of itself as a nation that's almost eternal. It's a very, you know, one of the things I'm going to miss about Mubarak are the jokes. You know, it's a country full of humor, full of, you know, it has a deep sense of civil society. It has a lot of recipes for success. So I think Egypt can succeed. And God knows, I hope it does. But as Egypt goes, so does most of the Arab world.
One thing I'd just like to mention is it's relevant, but particularly relevant to our series. As I recall, you went to Cairo the first time to teach because you were a conscientious objector.
That's true.
During the Vietnam
Yeah.
War.
I had no idea. I was in Dallas, and I didn't think they'd ever let a conscientious objector come out of Dallas. And nor was I religious in the sense of being religiously committed to nonviolence, like an Amish person or something like that. So I just didn't think it was going to happen, and then it did. And I don't know what I would have done. I don't know, Toby, if I would have joined you over there or gone to Canada or gone to prison. Those seem to be the three alternatives, although I was also offered the opportunity to get in the National Guard, which was mostly reserved at that time for members of the Dallas Cowboys. But I didn't know what I was going to do if I didn't get it, and then I got it. But I had 2 weeks to find a job. And so I thought I'd go to the UN. And I was sick of the political arguments about Vietnam at that time. You remember, it was tearing the country apart. It was tearing my family apart. My father and I'd have these terrible arguments, and I just wanted to get out of Dodge. And so I went to the UN. They said, no, we don't do that. But, here's a list of American institutions abroad. And one of them was directly across the street, 866 UN Plaza, was the office of the American University in Cairo. And I walk across the street. And I'd heard about the 1967 war, but it wasn't the war that I was, I didn't know we didn't have any diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time. I just walked across the street. And there were only like 200 Americans in the whole country of Egypt at that time, and they were trying to run this university. So 30 minutes later, they said, can you leave tonight? I've got the job. Oh, yeah, you got the job. Can you leave tonight? And I said, no, I can't leave tonight. My girlfriend's back in Boston. I haven't packed. I haven't told my parents what I'm doing. Can you leave tomorrow? Yeah, I can go tomorrow. So I flew back to Boston. I said to my girlfriend, now my wife, I'm going to Egypt for 2 years, and I don't know really where that leaves us. But, I called my parents from JFK and told them I'm flying to Cairo. And then I flew to Cairo, and I got there at midnight, and I taught my first class at 9 in the morning. And honestly, I knew so little about the Arab world in Egypt. I didn't know what language they spoke. And I had never taught. I just graduated. So I've never been in front of a class before. So I walk into this class, and they gave me the very lowest levels of these kids that were trying to learn English in order to get into the university. And there were 14 levels. UG1, I had UG 13 and 14. And so I walk into UG 14, and I said, does anybody here speak English? And someone said, you do. that was my first moment as a teacher. It was a thundering success.
It's funny, you're talking about that reminds me of Robert Graves' memoir, Goodbye to All That, his World War I memoir. At the end of that book, he describes his time at the University of Cairo, where he went to teach after World War I, one of the great poets of the 20th century. And he has these absolutely wonderful excerpts from some of his students' essays. They were learning English. And so you follow in big footsteps going there.
I just have to say, when I looked out the airplane, when I landed, there was a terminal, and it said, welcome at Cairo. I had a lot of work to do.
You did. You described, I thought, very interestingly, a lot of the kind of elements of the society there that contribute to this apparently endless conflict. Though, as you say, nothing is condemned to be forever. I mean, look what happened. One would have thought that what happened in what was happening in Northern Ireland would never find a solution, but it over time is resolving itself, and some balance has been found. So, of course, it's possible. One of the things that seemed to me to perpetuate these things, quite aside from the economic conditions that you describe and the kind of hopelessness of the young, has to do with absolutist ideologies, absolutist theologies that do not allow for even the possibility that another view might be right, and that in fact condemn those of other faiths or other beliefs, other ideologies as in some way demonic, less than human, and I see that kind of interest in your work, not just in the Looming Tower, but also in, say, your book about this hysteria that overcame the country in the late 80s and 90s on recovered memory, sexual abuse, satanic ritual abuse, that kind of thing, for which there was never a scintilla of evidence found, in fact, though hundreds and hundreds of people were remembering these things. That same kind of mass psychology, the paranoia that it produces, and the sense of us versus them, it seems to me, something that we have to worry about a bit in our own country. If you look at the political dialogue that takes place and the very us and them construction of language when people are, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I've always been interested in why people believe what they believe. And America is a great place to explore that because you can believe anything you want. That's not true in a lot of the world. You have to believe this, one thing. And, what you can do is believe it more or less. But essentially, this is what we're serving for belief. And that's not true in America. We have a smorgasbord. So why believe one thing and not another? And it's a question that I haven't entirely been able to answer despite exploring many different belief systems. I've become convinced that religion is much more influential in people's lives than politics, and they're very similar in kind. They are belief systems. But you can't understand the social disparities in the movements that you see taking place in the primaries right now. You can't understand what is causing these kinds of the abortion issues and the Wall Street and all this sort of thing. These are all belief systems that people have adopted. They're different from, Catholicism is different from Methodism and so on, but when people firmly believe one thing or another, they act on it. And that's why religion is so powerful. And I think that underlying our politics are these tectonic belief systems. Some of them are religious, and mainly they are religious. I think we're a very religious country. And they move the surface structure around so that you can't really understand why, you can't understand Rick Perry, or you can't understand Rick Santorum, or you can't understand any of these people, or you can't understand Obama without understanding where they came from through the belief systems that they grew up in. I'm writing about Scientology now, which is a very discredited, stigmatized religion. And it's interesting for me to talk to people in Scientology, but because people think, oh, that's ridiculous, I would never believe that. But if you've grown up, say, in Catholicism, and you've been told every day when you go to school that this is the way that we believe, and this is, this is the truth, and so on. That is also indoctrination, and it's a belief system that's very powerful in your life. I'm not saying they're equivalent. I'm just saying that belief systems control our behavior in a way I think is poorly appreciated. And I can't say that I've become an authority in it. It's just that I've spent a lot of time talking to people who believe things that are completely different. I wrote a book about the Amish. I've written a lot about Islam. I've written about Pentecostals. I've even, about one time when I came out to the Bay Area, I was writing about the Church of Satan. I wrote about Anton LaVey, the founder of, I've covered the waterfront. But it's still mysterious to me why people ally themselves to a belief system, especially ones that we think of as being absurd. Why do you cross that line? And the one thing that I think that extreme religions do is that the perceived absurdity surrounds them and creates a community. And so if you cross that line and say, I believe, then we are all brothers in this belief. However much you actually believe it, you have made that vow. And it's a safe, happy place to be. I wrote about Mormons during the Mormon Olympics, and I interviewed Mitt Romney, who was then brought in to sort of save the Olympics, and I had no idea who he was. And I'm not sure, but I think I called him Mutt. I'd never heard of him, and what kind of name is Mitt? But I asked him about his missionary work, and he spent 2 years in France, in the wine country, and Mormons are teetotalers. And he said, and it was not, he said, I didn't convert a single person. He said, have I got a religion for you? But if you take young people, send them out door to door for 2 years saying, knock, knock, this is what I believe. They may not convert anybody, as Mutt Romney did not, but it's very hard to walk back and leave that community because you've been very firmly bonded into it. So I think that the attraction of being a part of a community is very much a feature of it, and to some extent it's regionalism. If you're in Alabama, the Pentecostals and the Assembly of God and that sort of thing are going to be more predominant because it's a part of the culture. And Scientology is a part of the Hollywood culture. There are regionalisms that are expressed to some extent.
Well, thinking of the parallel with Islamism and Al-Qaeda, I was thinking that particularly in the Looming Tower, you put a lot of stress on the personalities not only of Bin Laden but also Zawahiri.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the effect of the death of Bin Laden, and surely that charismatic leadership figure was part of the bond that kept people in Al-Qaeda as a particular variant of Islamism. And it seems to me that probably Zawahiri, whom you've written about extensively, does not have that same charismatic authority that Bin Laden had, in part because of Bin Laden's religious piety as a leader of Al-Qaeda. So what do you think now that Bin Laden is gone and Zawahiri has taken over Al-Qaeda? What remains of Al-Qaeda?
Zawahiri has a real problem. He had his own terrorist group in Egypt, and he ran it into the ground. He was a terrible leader. He's anti-charismatic. He's got dandruff of charisma. He's a propagandist, and he's not a leader of men. Al-Qaeda is desperately searching for a leader. I thought Anwar al-Awlaki would have been the natural successor because he had that he had a charismatic presence, he spoke English, and he had religious authority. I thought he was a formidable successor, and fortunately he's off the scene too. So right now one can look at Al-Qaeda as a kind of religious cult. There is that element to it, and every movement like that has a successor problem. You have the charismatic individual that people rally around, and then you have to, when that person is off the scene, if it's going to survive, you have to have someone who can carry it forward. I don't know that Zawahiri can pull that off. And actually, I don't see anybody right now on the horizon who seems like a logical successor to him. My concerns about terrorism are really more in other groups. In Lashkar-e-Taiba, I think, is a group that I'm very worried about. It's a Pakistani group. And when I talked to one of my sources, Ali Safan, who is an Arab-American FBI agent, who was very, he at the time one of 6 Arabic-speaking agents in the FBI in 9/11. Now there are 9, so we're all right. But he said that after Battle of Tora Bora in Afghanistan in the end of 2001, and Al-Qaeda fled into Pakistan, every one of those people was picked up by Lashkar-e-Taiba and taken to a safe house. Lashkar was behind the Mumbai killings, and they were explicitly told to kill Americans. I think it's a real, and there it has in the Pakistani community worldwide, but especially in England and the U.S., there are deep roots to Lashkar, and so I'm very concerned about that. It's essentially a nationalist group, but it has affiliations with Al-Qaeda, and I think Al-Qaeda itself is the central Al-Qaeda is very much weakened by the death of Bin Laden, and the affiliates that were around the world that had joined Al-Qaeda basically were nationalist groups. And their concerns even now are nationalist in nature. And I think what's happened, they're having an identity crisis now that the tyrannies in their own countries are beginning to dissolve. And America hasn't done anything to stop it. Their perspective about how the world really works is being challenged. And I don't think that they have a purpose in the world at this point. So it's not to say that I think his terrorism is going to disappear. I just think you don't know where it's going to come next. I mean, when I was talking to your class today, I said to me one of the most worrisome groups that ever came up was Aum Shinrikyo, which was this Japanese group with all these brilliant engineers, and they were working on nuclear weapons and manufacturing sarin gas and this sort of thing. And this arose in the Japanese yoga community. You just don't know where something might arise like that. You just have to be aware that the idea is out that the template for terrorism and for small groups and even individuals to try to upset the balance of world power, that idea is very powerful, and I think people will try to act on it in the future.
Well, I can't resist asking then about drone strikes, since this is how al-Awlaki was removed from the scene. What do you think the effect is? This is going to be a centerpiece of Obama's counterterrorism policy. Do you think that's going to be negative, positive?
Well, no, I don't think it's going to. I mean, the Republicans aren't going to attack him for using drones. What I worry about is that everything we create comes back on us. We're there first. But when I was writing about the Director of National Intelligence, I got to go talk to the people that make all the gadgets, although they wouldn't show me any of the gadgets. I was very disappointed. But the head of that organization said that what they worry about is that these kids that are making computer viruses now will be able to make biological viruses very soon. And just think about how terrifying that can be, that you can imagine kids with the access to the knowledge and the equipment cooking up anthrax or whatever they might want to. I think that's, if you get back to the drone thing, I think it's a terrible moral dilemma. And I think it's creepy in a way that somebody in Arizona can be sitting behind a console, kill somebody all the way around the world and go out for a drink. On the other hand, I think our tools to try to diminish the force of terrorism are very few. And our intelligence, until now, has been rotten. We don't have very much of our own intelligence. We're beginning to gain some. But from 9/11, it was shocking how little we knew about what was going on in the rest of the world. And we were so dependent on agencies like the Pakistani ISI to tell us what we needed to know. And so we found ourselves in an unholy alliance with them. I'm eager for us to move on from this stage that we're in right now. I think that it's been a really difficult moral challenge in our country's history. And we've done a lot of things that we shouldn't be proud of. And yet we have protected ourselves. And in the political climate we're in now, I can only pray that nothing else happens, because we won't be talking about drone strikes or something like that. We'll be talking about something far more serious.